but thank you for coming. This is not the outdoor yoga, in case you were wondering. Some of you look like you're ready for yoga. Not really. This is about interoperability. So how many of you know something about interoperability? 3, okay. No, 6, 7, 8, 10 maybe? Okay, how many wish you knew something about interoperability? Okay. How many know how many syllables are in the word interoperability? 8. Did somebody say 8? That's correct. My name's Rob Abel, and I'm the Chief Exec of the IMS Global Learning Consortium. And we have with us an incredible panel who understand the topic of interoperability from 4 different perspectives in the K-12 domain. We have Tyler Bosmeny, who's the CEO of Clever. And of course, Clever is an up-and-coming platform for integrations of various types of tools and apps into the K-12 environment. Stephen Laster, I'll go in order. Steve Liffick, General Manager of School Data Sync at Microsoft. It's a company most people have heard of. Stephen Laster, Chief Digital Officer of McGraw Hill Education. Hi, Stephen. And last but not least, Melissa Loble, who's a local, I think, VP of Platforms and Partnerships from Instructure. Up and coming, not up and more than up and coming, I guess, one of the leading learning management system platforms in the world. So I wanted to get a sense, both from my perspective and the panel's perspective, how many of you actually work in a school district? That's a pretty fair amount. What would you guys say? 30% maybe? 25%? Okay, how many of you are suppliers of some sort? Okay, that's more, a little bit more. How many of you are not sure what you are at this point in time? You've come to the conference to try to figure out, what should I be when I grow up? Okay, maybe that's the case. So the general idea here is this term interoperability. It's really about how do products work together. You know, it's the idea that as digital products and platforms and content proliferate, the question is, how well do they work together? And is that important? Is that important to teachers, to students, to administrators, and so forth? And probably more importantly is, how will it happen? And is it happening? Is it happening right now? Is it happening in the future? Where is kind of the state of interoperability right now? Is it very basic? Is it advanced? And so forth. And I think if our panelists can't answer it, then no one can, because these 4 are definitely deeply involved in K-12 education. So I wanted to start off, and we'll give each of you a chance to say something about your perspective, where you're from in terms of your organization and so forth. But talk a little bit about, kind of what the main customer needs are driving your K-12 businesses this year. Because we're going to start with some very, very pragmatic issues and try to work our way into interoperability. So what's driving your K-12 business right now?
Yeah.
Tyler?
You want me to go first? Hi, everyone. Such an honor to be here. Thanks for having me. What's driving our passion at Clever around interoperability, for us, is largely personal experiences. So this problem is very personal for us. I started Clever 5 years ago. My co-founder was a tech director inside of a school district. And he was someone, and I watched him get really excited about the promise of online learning, blended learning and online assessments and, these things that we come to conferences like this and talk about all the time. And I watched him get really excited, go out and purchase a lot of products, get a lot of teachers on board and excited about kind of this new way of doing things. And this problem they were specifically had in Denver was they had such high student mobility and such a wide range of reading levels in his class that they were really struggling to teach to 30 students at 30 different levels. So they turn to technology, they go out and they get all the stuff. I watched their excitement on the first day of school kind of devolve into frustration within only a few months. And for us, it was just this really disheartening experience of, why is this happening? And so many of the answers we unraveled had to do with this word, this 8-syllable, apparently, word called interoperability. where teachers would get to the computer lab and the software wouldn't be set up with the right accounts, or the kids couldn't log into the programs, or they had moved schools but they were still in one school and not the new school. And there were these really kind of unsexy problems that were really making my co-founder's life and all of his teachers' life really difficult. And so about 5 years ago, we all quit our jobs to dedicate, our careers and our life to this problem of interoperability. We think it's really important. We think it is this essential, building block for, for progress. And it's been an incredible journey. I see a lot of customers and schools we work with in the room. But today, 5 years later, we work with about 70,000 schools in America. So about half of schools in the US are using Clever in some way. And we work with hundreds and hundreds of companies at this conference. So in many ways, coming here feels like a family reunion of sorts. And I would not say that we've solved interoperability by any stretch. We focus on such a I think we focus on a piece of interoperability, and I'm really proud of the work we've done there. But there is so much more to be done across so many axes. IMS Global is leading the way in a lot of these different areas. And so that's the perspective from which we come to this from. We've been working on this problem for a long time. It is our life's passion, and we still think there's a huge ways to go.
All right, thanks, Tyler. Steve, do you want to take a crack at that from the Microsoft perspective? What's driving your K-12 business right now?
Sure. So I don't know how many of you are aware. Thank you for having me and inviting Microsoft to participate in the forum here. Last Tuesday, Microsoft announced a wave of products dedicated to K-12, primarily education. And so our interest actually bridges my co-panelists here in that we think a lot like people trying to build experiences for students and teachers, some of which were announced, but experiences for students and teachers require a common understanding of who they are, how they fit together into classes, what the classes are. And another part of Microsoft's business is thinking a lot like Tyler's company of how can we help not only ourselves but others take advantage of this important metadata that helps us build deeply integrated experiences for the classroom, for students and teachers to drive learning outcomes. As Microsoft, it's been a couple years ago now, began to get serious more serious than we had been about focusing on learning outcomes, building platform and application experiences to drive K-12 education, we had to make sure we understood the needs of both constituencies, both the constituencies of teachers and students and what they require, and our ISV partners who would seek to build experiences that leverage our platform. So we continue to be excited to participate in the market, and interoperability will only fuel the ability of all of us to innovate. For various historical reasons, the diversity of sources of student information, not only in the US but all over the world, have proven a hindrance or a hampering, and certainly as the purveyor of a platform, the need that Clever and Tyler noticed, when you see lots and lots of ISVs writing exactly the same code and none of that code has anything to do about differentiating their product from another, that's a prime opportunity. So Microsoft decided not only for our own needs, but for those of the ecosystem, we would invest in making sure it's as easy as possible to connect our apps and others' apps to students, teachers, classes, who are the students and teachers in the classes. And that has been the fruits of our initial efforts in something I work on called School Data Sync. And of course, we will continue to invest over time, as evidenced by sort of the wave of products that just got announced last Tuesday. So we remain focused on empowering students and teachers to create the world of tomorrow, as the announcement mentioned. The sort of mission anchoring of Microsoft to do so makes it an exciting place to be, an exciting ecosystem to be a part of, and I'm very glad to be here talking to you and many of our customers and partners to make it happen.
All right, thanks Steve. Stephen Laster, McGraw-Hill, major publisher. What's driving your K-12 business?
Thank you, and thank you guys for having me here today. I want to start by apologizing for the fact that this meeting is happening today. Because if we were really doing interoperability well, nobody would be in the room. So the very fact that we're having this session really describes how poorly we're progressing. To McGraw-Hill and to me, the only reason McGraw-Hill exists is to work in service of districts and teachers and curriculum committees to help teachers do what they do really well and to help drive student outcomes. And we play a very small role in that, and we hope it's a helpful role. And we also know that today's classroom is a blended classroom, blended analog to digital, blended by multiple providers. And we think it's built on this idea of academic choice and freedom, and we think that's powerful. So we know that an engaged teacher who cares deeply about her students, armed with a world-class curriculum and an engaging experience, changes lives. And that's our focus. The reason we're here today is because this idea of interoperability is getting in the way of those goals. It's a messy world out there. For those of you who are in districts, you know that. It's a world where creative destruction and experimentation is difficult for every reason Steve just said. That we need identity. We need that student to be part of that digital tool. We need all those grades to end up in one place so that the bureaucracy of technology doesn't get in the way of the joy of teaching. And frankly, when that's working really well, none of you will come listen to us, and that'll be a good day. So what McGraw-Hill believes quite deeply is it's getting better. We hope we're making it better. And we believe in a world of choice. We believe that we should earn our role in your classroom by the quality of the curriculum we help you put together, and by the teaching and learning experience we play a small role in affording you to deliver. And we're so confident in that, we believe that that choice should be easy for you, the district, the teacher, to implement. Meaning, invite us in. If we make a difference, keep us. And if the day comes where you no longer need us, make it easy to bring in somebody who's more relevant to you. So how many of you were working in 1996? Anybody? How many of you remember that maybe you were on Lotus Mail and I was on CompuServe, and we wanted to share a marketing brief or a curriculum or a paper, and we couldn't because we were in different email systems? Now, I don't know if interoperability in email made life better or not, because I have about 300 unread emails right now. But I tell you, we don't worry about that and text messaging as ways of communicating regardless of provider. And we're not beholden on anybody to construct a closed ecosystem for that either. It just all simply works. So I hope that this conversation is about what we all can do to drive an open world where everything works together in ways you want to mash it up, and the technology fades into the background, and the teaching lives in the foreground. And when we arrive there, we can move on to the next most important conversation.
All right, thank you, Stephen. Melissa, it's kind of, I think, fortuitous that we're sort of ending with you on this because, I mean, for years and years, I've been doing the IMS thing now for over 11 years, and for probably about the first 5 or 6 of those years, whenever we got in a discussion in K-12 around interoperability, the first thought that would come out would be, well, we don't have any platform to plug things into.
Yep.
You know, and so what are we plugging our things into, right? And I think the LMSs, you know, and the various types of new sort of platforms that are coming into play, including Clever, you know, in K-12, is a very, very interesting phenomena, which is, of course, very closely tied to the idea of interoperability. So what are your thoughts on what you're seeing in K-12 and driving your, or Canvas's business there?
Sure. So thank you all for having me as well on this panel. So I am responsible for our interoperability strategy for all of the platforms that Instructure supports, particularly Canvas, which is probably what you're all familiar with as the LMS. And since its foundation 6 years ago or so, we've been focused on a couple of really key principles, 2 of which I think really apply to interoperability. One is adoption. So the only way that we're going to see innovation happen is the actual use of all of these great tools. We need to see adoption. And districts, as we all know, are so hard-pressed for staff and help and time and resources that really it's beholden to the technologies out there to ensure that adoption can happen. And really a key part of that is one of our second principles, and that's this idea of interoperability, or allowing free access to our platform for technology companies to understand how best to integrate with us And then providing coaching for how can you be that central tool that folks can plug tools into. So true story, the last two major RFPs that we've received from large school districts, very, very, very large school districts, have sent over matrices of at least 60 tools as part of their RFP. And they say to an LMS, yes, we need an LMS, we need that foundational platform, but we also want you to directly respond to, and this is required, how do you work with these 60 plus different tools? The only way we can do that, and the only way technologies can do that, is if we all use standards and we all have centralized approaches. I feel sorry for the really awesome, innovative tool out there that has to go and create completely different integrations for 10 different platforms and then figure out how to work with even the non-platform tools out there. That's so much work, they can't actually innovate on their platform and provide that innovation to districts so that they can really adopt all of these great technologies out there. So having standards-based, and we've pushed since our foundation standards, particularly the IMS standards, LTI, if any of you are familiar with that, and others that are emerging, we feel really strongly that by encouraging those, by directing technologies to those, and holding up our end of the bargain, innovating on those standards, actively participating in the discussions around those standards, that we can then encourage this idea of adoption. And we can encourage districts to be able to innovate themselves and technologies to help districts innovate. So it's a foundation to who we are, and it's exciting. I think about everybody on this panel, and we work with everybody, and work really nicely and see really great innovations that have come from how we all work together.
All right, thanks, Melissa. The next question we want to drill down on is specifically what areas of interoperability or types of products that you think need to be working together right now. Where are you seeing the most compelling need? And maybe since in the first round there was a lot of sentiment of, well, this is a barrier, interoperability is holding us back, maybe a little, well, what do we need to really accelerate? What do we need to do to accelerate things, just from your own, personal perspective? So highest priority integrations that you're seeing from the school district perspective, and what should we be doing to really accelerate the curve so we just, push through the situation we have where apparently interoperability is still a pretty large barrier.
Yeah, I think a big part of it is having a logical architecture, and I think you were hitting on that quite nicely. So your classroom isn't just a collection of 60 tools living in free will, because if it is, it's really hard for the teacher and the students to conceptualize how these all fit into their curriculum, into their learning. So we've seen districts that have incredibly seamless ecosystems, and at the core of all of that is, yes, a commitment to standards. That's got to be central to it. But even more deeply than that is a picture of what the result should be. So where is the class space centrally located? What is the grade book? How are we going to store and see and make use of learning data? What are the metaphors? Is it a resource library as a metaphor? Is it a library as a metaphor? But some design that allows humans to understand the goodness that all of these different technologies play. And then when you bring them together where identity is flowing seamlessly, when grades are moving seamlessly, this beautiful reinforcing thing happens where they get used. But the starting point of it is really being able to understand, as I move into this world that's blended, how does the digital world help me fit? What's the language around it? And that's more of a user challenge and user architecture than it is, quite frankly, a technology architecture. The two need to work hand in glove, but you need both to drive adoption, I would argue.
I would jump in and considering who's sitting next to me, I would say content is really important, and we're doing a so-so job at that. And I'm going to use content as a broad phrase. So it's the traditional content that we think of, but then it's also new types of resources and everything from games and simulations to interactive textbooks, all of that. That needs a way to plug into systems really seamlessly. There are folks innovating like McGraw Hill and how that looks, but then there's still so much out there that we need to figure out how we make it super easy. And I think this is probably very personal to LMS platforms, but how do we make it super easy for teachers to find that content and use that content in effective ways? So if I had to pick a category, content's my favorite category right now of trying to really drive towards interoperability.
All right.
So I would say I love Stephen and Melissa's vision, and I subscribe to it too on both of those points. But I also see the perspective of kind of where we are today and problems that I feel like I'm always advocating that we don't skip over or take for granted certain steps along the way. A great example of that is single sign-on. I think a lot of us like to get on panels like these and act like single sign-on was a problem we all solved 5 or 10 years ago. And what's shocking to me is, as I've gone into lots of school districts recently, the majority, like probably the median school district and then some, students have 15 to 20 different usernames and passwords. There's no single sign-on platform in place. And it's about 2 years ago, we created a solution for this. We made it free to schools and we made it free to applications. And 2 years later, we have about 1 in 10 students in America logging into our single sign-on platform every month. And you don't see that kind of growth unless there's you don't see that kind of growth if the problem's been solved. You see that kind of growth if there's huge problems that are maybe being overlooked or not solved. And so I want to get to the data-driven classroom where the content seamlessly interoperates with the assessment and the platform and the teacher has the just-in-time information that they need. But I also take a really sober view of where we're at today, which is there are such basic challenges in schools that certainly some school districts have solved. We want to help more school districts solve. But as an industry, we have a long ways to go on some of the most basic foundations of interoperability. And that stuff doesn't usually get talked about on panels like these, but I think it's one of the most important next steps for us.
Okay.
I would agree, and I would bridge the worlds. What Tyler's talking about is empowering a common view of identity, which is the root that allows you to connect what's happening in all of these 60 different experiences. So, Rob, I'll go ahead and promote IMS. It turns out, just like SSO is a core sort of start, or identity is a root of enabling the world we want to create for teachers and students, so is removing the boundaries between data exchange, which is what a IMS does with a standard called One Roster. There are others around the world. But part of what has to happen is I'll use the word commoditization, the breaking down of barriers, that's what you called it, Stephen, where the data, well, of course you just exchange data. Exchange isn't interesting. What's interesting is what you do with it. And I would take a little bit of the sort of we're not where we need to be yet view of Tyler and combine it to that's where we're going.
Yep.
And it's just how fast can we get the industry to rally around common notions of data formats, models, what are the objects that matter, and identity that allow us to anchor them spanning applications.
And I think that's spot on. And I agree with Tyler that you can't skip over the commoditized basics to get to teaching and learning. They're a prerequisite to it. I think our job is to do it, I think in the way that Steve was saying, is really do that around open standards, really make it as low cost and as easy as possible, because it is a fleeting problem. We did see this, by analog, this problem in higher ed in 1999. Now, it was solved by putting the LMS at the center of everything. And the reason why our higher ed customers don't have the same issues because of platforms like Canvas are sitting at their center, and through LTI, we're just part of Canvas and all rostering and everything solved. Recognizing that may not be the right course for K-12, and that's okay. I'm not suggesting that has to be it. But I am very optimistic that the confusion around identity or the challenge, and no, nobody should have 20 passwords, that's antithetical to an efficient classroom. We will solve that if we keep our eyes on the prize. And the eyes on the prize has to be a more engaging, a more effective classroom, because we know what's happening at the end of K-12 as we go to our community colleges, and it's not pretty. And that it's got to start there, and I believe it's got to be in service of that better outcome.
Okay, so I think what we're hearing from all the panelists is that there appears to be motivation on all sides. I mean, to improve interoperability, we've got 4 suppliers up here who are motivated, and they represent probably many, many more suppliers who feel the same way, I would say, from my perspective. We've also got school districts who are feeling the pain, right? So I'm going to ask the panelists to, if they're willing to volunteer a school district they may be aware of that's just doing a great job, scaling the interoperability of digital resources, tools, whatever. But first, I'd like to know, are there any school districts, I'm not going to ask you who you are, but are there any school districts in the audience that feel that you've just done a great job interoperability? Yes, there are all these challenges, but you've done a great job. You've really scaled a solution to integration of digital assets, tools. No one?
You should ask the question in two parts. Are there districts, and have they solved the problem?
Well, we asked the districts earlier. There was
that's
about 25 people who said they were from districts or so. So no one's willing to say we've just done a super duper great job. Okay, well, panelists, do you guys know of it? So I'm a little discouraged because this sounds really hard and this is my job. So I wish my job was a lot easier than this. So you guys give me some encouragement by telling me about some districts that may have done a good job at this. Anyone?
So I just want to call out Melissa Dodd, CTO, San Francisco Unified, three rows back, CTO of the year. I think she's being very humble in not raising her hand because San Francisco is a district that is embracing online learning in a big way. And just, I think there's probably still a lot of challenges to solve. Maybe that's why you didn't want to shout it from the rooftops, but I think that's a great example of one. And I bet there's other ones out here in this room who are doing great things, but maybe just don't feel like they've solved it because I think it's a never-ending challenge.
Well, I think I would say the feedback I get, and of course I don't talk to every district in the world, but we've got about 50 or so districts involved in IMS. The feedback that I get is that, hey, compared to where we were 3 or 4 years ago, we're really good. We're really good.
Common.
Rather than sort of unlimited number of integrations, we have some reasonably manageable set of integrations and so forth, and we've been able to scale digital materials and resources. But on the other hand, there's increasing demand. The demand keeps rising for more tools, more digital, more this, more that. Plus on top of it, there is the whole strategy issue that Stephen Laster brought up, or the design issue as he put it, right? What is our design, right? What are our launch up points for digital content and so forth? But I wanted to stay if you guys are aware of some districts.
I would say the pattern, sorry.
No, go ahead, please.
The pattern, I would build on the Melissa comment. We work with local districts closely in part because it's easy. But there's a district in a suburb of Seattle called Bellevue. And a pattern that is clear is that where IT is very, very strong, they're farther ahead. And that is both good and bad. It's good in that they're ahead, and they teach us everything as they tell us the ways in which we are not yet meeting all of their needs. However, it has to get easier. It can't be the super strong IT staff is the only way to make all of this stuff work. So we're kind of in the middle of this transition, and the idea is that sort of with greater universality, we get the kind of identity and data alignment that maybe the best or the best, that's not the right word, the most advanced IT staffs are able to create today.
So I think it's important for districts to be active in the interoperability conversations. So I'll shout out Katy ISD and Broward, who are really active in conversations at IMS about developing the standards. And without having the district voice, we can't accomplish what's the design vision for what this looks like. I've been on a number of interoperability calls and talking about new standards and frameworks where it's all vendors. And that doesn't do any of us good, right? And so I would call out those two because we work with those two districts really well. And they're very focused on interoperability, but just for their participation in the conversation.
Yeah, and I think building on that and in full agreement, I think if you look at districts like Baltimore County and look at Houston, it was purposeful architecture. So whether it was making all these digital resources easily available, whether it was a really thoughtful design on a learning data warehouse and feeding that, it was all in service of a curricular goal and an educational outcome. And so yes, districts and suppliers and technology intermediaries all have to be in the standard conversation. And yes, we all have to recognize that conversation is an enabling means to a greater end. And when all of that pulls together, I think, Robbie, you're spot on. I think what you're hearing is we are seeing a lot of goodness, and we are seeing an acceleration of success. And as a recovering higher ed CIO, it takes great CIOs in our districts to really bridge that world of geek and education, and that is, I think, just the best enabler you can think of.
So if I could, I just want to make an observation. We all called out different districts, all wonderful districts. And yet we all, when you asked for examples of who's doing interoperability well, we all pointed to, I think, some of the best resourced and most technologically advanced districts in the country. I think all of those districts have that reputation, in part because of their work on standards. But there's a fundamental challenge in K-12 that I've learned in the past 5 years, which is that for most districts, they are trying to do so much, maybe to an impossible degree. An example of this, I met with Debbie Karcher this morning from Miami-Dade. Miami-Dade, 400,000 students. They are, to put that in perspective, 10 times the size of Google. The entire company of Google, they were supporting 10 times as many people as Google does. Probably with an IT budget, that's 1/10 the size of Google. And so when you look at what districts are asked to do, it's easy for companies like mine and others to get on the stage like this and say, if everybody just worked a little bit harder, we would be in the promised land of interoperability. And of course, all the trend lines are in the good direction. But I do believe there's a fundamental reason why this is such a hard challenge. And one of them has to do with vendors and things we can do differently. And another of it is just the reality of what schools are up against. And I think making interoperability kind of the default for many school districts is one of the ways that we can perhaps take this next step forward. But I think we have to also just be very self-aware of what we're asking of them.
Right. I think that's spot on, and I think, though, to Melissa's point, it's got to be an engaged conversation. So as a community, we could achieve interoperability in some really perverse ways that add expense, that stifle innovation, and that make our students worse off. Or we could do, I think what this panel is saying, is that really build a standards-based open ecosystem that's low cost and that's full of choice. Without districts in the center of that conversation, who knows where it goes? Right? Because in essence, we're all working on behalf of districts on this stage. And so in a funny way, we'll know when we're succeeding when the participation rates are flipped. Right? And what I encourage, if nothing else, is every district to get involved and to have a voice and to understand that interoperability isn't this monolithic thing. There's not one way to do it. There are many ways to do it, and many of them are wonderful and a few are not so wonderful. Let's hear your voice.
Yeah, I'm all for that. That's great. I wanted to, since we have Microsoft on the panel, I wanted to have a question about the role in general of what some analysts call the operating system companies in all of this. That would include Microsoft, Google, Apple, maybe even Amazon, arguably. How do they play into this big picture of what districts are dealing with? And maybe Steve, if you want to go first, you can say it for your perspective, but I'm interested in everybody's perspective on this as well.
Sure. The first thing I would say is that if you talk to any district in the country, there isn't one platform. I have yet to run into a district that isn't running, for lack of a better, Windows and iOS or various Apple products and Google's products.
Yeah.
So really, as nice as it might be to a platform vendor to think that this is a world that can exist, I actually think that that's a false hope, and that instead, most of the platform vendors have a role to help themselves enable a heterogeneous environment seamlessly. The reality is a district today that has thousands of machines from any vendor, what does a platform vendor that isn't that vendor imagine is going to happen to them? Are they going to evaporate? Are they going to be thrown away and replaced with Windows devices? Well, of course not. And it is, in fact, the level of platform above the hardware and the operating system, like the cloud, that enable a rich experience for students and teachers to be delivered that drives learning outcomes without depending so much on which particular hardware platform is in place, because that's the reality. Mm-hmm. We are all about, you're building apps for every platform. We're building cloud services for every platform. Tyler. And so I guess I would say the role of the platform vendor is to be a great citizen in the community of platforms serving our students and teachers and the IT staff sort of dedicated to making them successful.
And does that include interoperability at kind of the app level, right? Because there are apps that will live in Clever, so to speak. You know, Clever apps will be apps that are integrating with Clever. There'll be apps integrating with Canvas. There'll also be apps integrating with Microsoft. How does the school district figure all that out?
They have a grand plan, perhaps, with Stephen.
I know that's a hard question.
That I would say what I see more often is rather more tactical. We're trying to get through the next year, the next 3-year plan, and we've got some amount of money to do that, and we have some starting point to do that.
So it's evolution.
And
it's an evolution.
It's evolution. It's not revolution. I guess to Tyler's point, there are districts that have enough resource to do, but they are the vastly small percentage. And so I approach the job of what we're doing at Microsoft, and this is literally, what do we have to do to make the answer yes? That's how a platform vendor should think about school districts. What does Microsoft have to deliver to make our Office product the right choice, to make Teams something students and teachers will want to use, or from my standpoint, to make the data platform, identity with our sort of Azure Active Directory or school data sync, why should they say yes? I think I'm in the job of making them say yes, somehow.
I think it's interesting because so Canvas, we've integrated deeply with Microsoft products, we've integrated with Google products, Amazon products, and we still get asked, why are you doing that? Aren't they competitive? Aren't they starting to inch themselves into the LMS space? And I think central to that is it doesn't matter if they're competitive or not. We need to be able to advise our districts to make the best choices for them. And if it happens to be not to use the Canvas gradebook and to use a tool, a Microsoft tool, if it happens to be any sort of combination of that, to be okay with that. That what we need to do is, once again, empower the districts and help them find those right choices for themselves. Probably any district has one or two of their technologies vendors that they rely on as an advisor, not just as a supplier. And it's that advisor's role to advise and not to always say, use my tool, only my tool, all of my tool, even if there's something competitive that you also use that might distract some of your users from my tool. If we stop playing that way, I think districts will still want to use all of our tools, but will then accomplish what they need to accomplish, and then we need to act as advisors and help them get there.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Anyone else have a comment on the role of the operating system companies?
So I think the larger the company, the greater the responsibility. It has to be open. And building on what Melissa and Steve were both saying, there's no such thing as a McGraw-Hill school. There's no such thing as a Microsoft school, and nor should there be. They're just schools that benefit from what we offer. And the minute you realize it's not a winner-take-all market, it's not this market of walled gardens, the more you start to help districts, teachers, and students. And we believe that to our core. And so, seeing Microsoft with school data sync and embracing IMS standards and allowing us to meet them at the IMS standard, all of a sudden, you've got a lot of scale with open standards, and you've made things less complicated, and that feels good. We'll earn usage by how we impact the classroom positively, and that's where it should begin and end for everybody.
The only other thing I'll add to that is you were talking about the multi-platform approach. It's interesting. One trend I've noticed that sort of relates to interoperability because it raises the stakes for interoperability is whereas I do think there used to be districts that saw themselves as we're a Microsoft district or we're a Chromebook district. I talked to a district the other day that said we are deploying Google Apps and Office 365 to all of our students next year and giving them choice. We are doing Windows Surface for all of our high schoolers, but we're doing Chromebooks for all of our middle schoolers and maybe iPads for the K through 2. And that feels new. And I don't know if that is a leading indicator or a lagging indicator of interoperability getting better. I don't know if it will work. There's so many questions, but it's just an interesting thing that school districts feel empowered to try lots of things, to Stephen's point, and then see what kind of earns its place in their schools.
Okay, so we've been talking a lot about launching, single sign-on, rostering, things like that, table stakes sort of things, or things that probably should be table stakes that we're still have some way to go on, clearly. What about the infamous category of what a lot of people call data back, or getting data out of applications? Because of course, isn't that one of the promises of digital, right, is getting more data and putting the data in the hands of people so that it's usable, you know, the teachers, the students, administrators, whoever. Where are we on all that?
I think gone are the days where systems are holding tight to their data. Our new challenge is how do we visualize other systems' data? So I see, you know, because this is important to us. People want data out of our solutions, and they want to be able to bring other data into our solution. So it goes way back to that design comment. We're not as worried anymore about technologies holding my data hostage. And if you're working with if you're a district and you're working with a technology that's doing that, I promise you there's another one out there that's not, that's just as good. So we're not holding data hostage, but what we're instead having trouble with is figuring out where do you want to see, very tactically, what dashboards, what information, what combinations of information. Are you, you know, those big, very wealthy districts are the ones that have opportunities to have data warehouses and then tools that specialize and sit on top of that to visualize that data. But how are we getting into districts' hands the right technologies to take all of this data and actually make it in some way usable for the teacher and the administrator and the folks that just don't have time to weave through the complexity that it produces?
Yeah, and I think building on that, I think we're in early days of what it will do for us. So I think at a course level, for many, many years, we've seen the power of a machine-readable description of a curriculum. And we've seen in things like math, as an example, when you have that and you build intelligence and algorithms underneath that, you can really drive better student outcomes. And then we've certainly seen in healthcare, for better and for worse, the machine-readable body of diagnoses has allowed the healthcare record to become more shared, and you've seen efficiencies there. I think we're starting to see it on the edges in some districts and some initiatives around how to make state standards machine readable. That's a starting point. But it's really got to go deeper, and that is we need, if the machine's going to help us, and it can, thoughtfully implemented, we need to be able to start describing not just result data, but curriculum description and its relationship to each learning node in ways that do give those educators and parents and students actionable dashboards. That's probably as futuristic as we've talked about today. But when that starts happening after we've done all the prerequisite work, that's where this stuff starts to create endless opportunities. And it gets pretty exciting.
Yeah, so go ahead. All right.
Oh, I was just going to say, fun fact, we get asked about data back everywhere we go. We talk to school districts, hey, can Clever help with data back? Many of our customers, the applications say, hey, can Clever help with data back? Fun, like, kind of internal Clever note, my co-founder, who's head of product, has actually banned the phrase data back within Clever. And if you say it near, like, in his vicinity, he kind of just, like, you know, gets really anxious. And the reason is because what he says, which I actually think is really profound, is he says data back is not a problem, it's not a use case, it's not connected to a learning goal, it is a technical phrase. It's like a technical direction of data. And so when we think about data back, I do think there will be steps forward in the industry. I hope, for everyone's sake, there's hope, there's step forwards in the industry. But I actually think data back is this all-encompassing glob of things where, you know, maybe to Melissa, it means data is coming into the LMS gradebook, and, you know, maybe Stephen has needs of pushing things into SISs, and, you know, maybe for other people it's into analytics tools. And, you know, I love the concept of data back as an interoperability geek, but I think there's a burden on both districts and apps to start coming up with really concrete use cases that are exciting. And Rob, I would actually encourage IMS to lag a little bit on this type of work, because I think the way, you know, my belief on how the best standards get built is you kind of look at what people are doing and then you use that as a template to create really good open standards that are an improvement on that. And that's my, you know, I was just reading about Warren Buffett's $1 Million Bet the the other day because they had this big event in Omaha. If I were to bet $1 million, which I would never do, it would be that will be the path for data back in education, which is some companies, some vendors, some districts will get together, will make a really compelling use case. Then there will become open standards that kind of encapsulate that use case, and more vendors and more districts will get involved. And until that point, I would encourage us as an industry to take my co-founder's approach to data back and say, no, but what problem are we going to solve there?
I would agree with Tyler, except I would say if the core purpose and mission of schools is to drive learning outcomes, it's possible to make some guesses as to what the kinds of data that will drive the most value for everyone in the ecosystem are first. For example, and most simply, grades. You could call them boring, standardized assessments and grades, but it turns out they may be boring, but we have no way to correlate the association of any use of any app content provider with the driving of grades in a general industry standard way. So yes, it is not a broad sort of schema of data, but I think it's reasonable to assume, and certainly from a mission standpoint, the first scenario for which I want it to be true, let's put it that way, is how do we actually prove something materially drives learning outcomes, and what are the specific data elements, frankly, hopefully already broadly, you don't want to create new ones. Grades exist, if that's the one. How can we link the activity of an app to learning outcomes?
Yeah,
that's what we're looking at.
And I think it's deeper than that. I think I'm more optimistic than that wait for the world to change viewpoint. And I would stipulate that there's fantastic work being done already. There's a fantastic body of research that talks about things like conscious incompetence and how do you see it and how do you think about it. There's work that started out of the NSF that's been in classrooms for 20 years that really allows us to see at a very fine-grained level in the state of Utah today how students are progressing on math in the classrooms and makes them confident learners. Now, I agree that there are many disconnected experiments going on, but they're all public. The information is all available to the district to make use of if they have the inclination to do it. And I think it's from that creative innovation that the bigger world emerges. But I don't want to go another 10 years of failing math kids to wait for a data standard to evolve. Right? I want to experiment, and then let the successes coalesce. Because we're kind of out of time. And by the way, this is where the power of EdTech starts to kick in. If the power of EdTech is we're interoperable, what a waste of money. If the power of EdTech is you have your ebooks and you have your automated quiz grading, this has been a tragedy. But if the power of EdTech is helping a confident learner succeed with maybe a little less human support and helping a teacher have the information she needs to be a master teacher, then we've made a difference. And so I think in that spirit, we need to iterate in the spirit of Agile. We need to experiment more than ever. And yes, IMS can be attuned to it and part of it, and yes, it'll organize its way out over time. But gosh, let's not wait.
All right, well, on those very nice words, I'm afraid we're out of time. So please thank yourselves for coming, and let's thank our panelists for a great panel.